Welcome to Understanding Islam, Part 7. We're looking today at Islam's critique of Judaism and Christianity. There's a lot of material here and a lot of references to the Quran, so if you want to get the full detail, then you need to go to my website and download the article that goes with this episode, and you'll find all the references there. The first thing that we need to get clear is that Islam teaches always a continuity between God and God's relationships with humankind. So a continuity of revelations culminating in the Quran. So the Quran doesn't see itself as a new revelation, a new guidance sent by God, as though it had never been there before, but rather it is a confirmation of the earlier guidance that has been sent, and it also comes to correct errors that have crept into those earlier revelations. In the same way, Islam is a correction of belief. So, for example, we're told that Abraham is Hanif. He is neither a Jew nor a Christian. He is a Hanif, a pure monotheist, believing in God alone. And so part of Islam's relationship with these two faiths is to purge any errors that have come into their understanding of God. And this is particularly pertinent with reference to Christianity. The third thing we can say is that there is a continuity of prophets, and all prophets are to be acknowledged by the true believers because they are all prophets sent by God. So the challenge is put to the Jewish community to recognize the prophethood of Jesus and to recognize the prophethood of Muhammad. And the challenge is put to the Christian community to recognize and affirm the prophethood of Muhammad. When the Quran talks about Jews and Christians, it uses the phrase "a party amongst them." There's always a question, it's not a blanket judgment. This means that a party amongst them are on the true path that was set out by the prophets Moses and Jesus. Another party amongst them has gone astray. So it's not possible just to make a blanket judgment and say all Jews X, all Christians X. There's always room then for that discernment and for that judgment. Are you truly on the path established by your prophets? And that obviously leaves open the possibility that some at least have deviated from that path. The Jews and Christians are the communities that have received an earlier revelation from God. To Prophet Moses was sent the Torah, to Prophet Jesus was sent the Injil. Now, what's happened to those scriptures? And again, the Quran makes some challenges there to say, you've been careless with them, perhaps you have concealed part of their meaning, perhaps you have altered some of their verses. And so the question of the earlier revelations is important here. If only the Jews and Christians were in possession of the full text of the earlier revelations that were sent, and the teaching of those respective prophets, and if only they would follow the Sharia that was established by Moses and by Jesus, then that would naturally lead them into an appreciation of Quran and Prophet Muhammad, and therefore the Sharia that Muhammad established as well. The Quran tells us that it was part of God's plan that there should be a plurality of messages sent to the earth, a plurality of Sharias that were established by those earlier prophets. If God had wanted, God could just have established one Sharia. But God established a plurality in order to test people on how true they would be, how faithfully they would follow that earlier Sharia. Of course, if only they had followed it faithfully, then they would have seen and recognized the validity of the Quran and the prophecy of Muhammad. Therefore, Muslims are warned not to copy the errors of the earlier communities, not to follow them into the kind of errors that they have committed. But at the same time, the judgment always is left up to God. It is God who will ultimately judge how faithfully the earlier communities have lived according to the guidance that was sent to them. Last week, when we used the term people of the book, we saw that it was including four groups, not only the Jews and Christians, but also the Sabaeans and the Magians. This week, we're just going to use this term, people of the book, with reference to Jews and Christians. Sometimes it's not easy to see which of these two communities is being addressed. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes the context tells us it's one only. Two things stand out particularly about the relationship of the Muslims with the Jews and Christians. Firstly, the Quran tells us that the food of the Jews and Christians is halal for Muslims. It is permitted for Muslims to eat it. So that we saw that when some of the first Muslims moved to Britain, for example, and they couldn't get halal meat, they would go to the Jewish kosher butcher. Now, there's more of a problem with Christian food, because there's a question whether or not those Christians who have killed these animals are truly pronouncing the name of the one and only God, or if they have deviated from that pure monotheism, the monotheism of Jesus, and instead are invoking a figment of their own imagination, some kind of three-part God. Now, we'll see more of this later on. The second thing which is important is that the Quran says that the wives, the women of the Jews and the Christians, are permitted for Muslims to marry, and they are allowed to continue in the practice of their faith. So there is a sense then in which these two communities, the Jews and the Christians, have a special privileged position within the relationship with Islam. In a couple of places in the Quran, we hear a grouping. The believers, that is the Muslims, and the people of the book, those who worship God, those who fear the last day, those who act according to the guidance of God, they will have their reward from God, and no fear shall come upon them. They will not grieve. But then there's another verse of the Quran which says that anyone who accepts a religion other than Islam, it will not be taken from them. It will not be accepted from them. The majority of Muslim scholars have understood this to mean that even though Jews and Christians are worshipping God, they are not worshipping according to the last revelation, the final prophet, and therefore their worship will not be accepted from them, because they should align that worship with the teaching of Quran and Muhammad. There is a minority position amongst Muslim scholars that says that as long as they are submitting to the one God only, so Islam, if you like, in this generic sense, then that will be accepted. So some dispute amongst the scholars on this point. Turning now to look at the relationship of Islam to the Jews, it is clear, first of all, that Jews are monotheists. They are following to and have abided by the teachings of Prophet Moses. God made a covenant with them, and God is faithful to the covenants that God makes. But it is the Jews then who have broken that covenant. At least a group amongst them, because again the Quran mentions an upright group who continue to worship, to practice according to the teaching of Moses. Muslims are told that you should consult the people of the earlier scriptures in order to find out the background information to some of the episodes that are recorded in the Quran. And in the early period of Islamic commentary on the Quran, there was a practice of going to consult the Jewish communities, Jews who had converted to Islam, in order that one could find out the background detail of the various episodes or stories that are related in the Quran. There was a tension between the Jewish communities that Muhammad encountered and himself, because he expected that they would recognize his prophethood. And indeed they responded instead that prophets arise from the house of Israel, they do not arise from your people. And so there was a rejection of his prophethood. Indeed, the Quran says that they should know from their scriptures that there was to be an Ummi prophet who would be sent. There was to be the unlettered prophet who would arise from the community of the people of Ishmael, and so they didn't recognize him. In the same way, Jews are criticized for claiming proprietorial rights over God. God is our God. We are God's chosen people. And in the same way of saying that only we will enter into heaven, and that we will not taste of hell, or if we do, it will only be for a short time. So some serious charges are leveled against the followers of Prophet Moses today. One of the most serious charges which is laid against the Jewish community is the way in which they have carelessly handled the revelation that was sent to Prophet Moses. Now, it is clear Moses is a prophet of God. He received a revelation from God. Therefore, there is nothing defective about Prophet Moses or about the Torah, the scripture that was given. If anything has happened, it has happened in subsequent generations within the community. It is not to be attributed back to Moses himself. And yet the Quran makes various charges in saying that some meanings have been concealed, tongues have been twisted around words, some verses have been altered. Indeed, even on one occasion, that some verses have been deliberately written by the Jewish scholars and then attributed to God. Now, these are very serious accusations. And indeed, the Quran says in one place that this community bearing the Torah but not abiding by it is like an ass that is carrying along books, but it doesn't profit from reading them. So some serious charges are leveled there. The important principle is that of continuity of revelations. Therefore, that which was given to Moses must have in essence agreed with the Quran that was given to Muhammad, and continuity of prophecy. That is, that the true followers of Moses should recognize the prophethood both of Jesus and of Muhammad himself. When it comes to Christianity, the Islamic tradition is wary that Christians have deviated from some of the most fundamental points in Islamic understanding. First of all, in the absolute oneness of God, Tawheed. Does the doctrine of Trinity equate with Tawheed? And also in the absolute transcendence of God. How can one talk of an incarnation of God in human form? Also, the Quran is the correction of the earlier scriptures and the earlier traditions, and so it corrects matters of fact like the crucifixion, the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, which are central to Christian teaching, but which are not supported by the Quran and therefore by Islam. So some very serious charges are laid against central elements of Christian belief. The Quran speaks of the Christians going to excess. They are taking things that are true about Prophet Jesus and then going to excess, going beyond the boundaries that Scripture will allow. And therefore one of the terms used of Christians is the people of excess. Nevertheless, the Quran and Islam always has a differentiated view here. At one time, the Quran speaks of the Christians as being the nearest in affection to the Muslims, because there are those amongst them, monks, priests, who are humble and who are full of wisdom, and their eyes fill with tears when they hear the message of the Quran. On other occasions, these very same monks are accused of eating up the wealth of the ordinary people. They are also accused of having developed doctrines that are not substantiated by the teaching of Jesus, and indeed that the Christian community has been led astray by those doctrines that have been developed by the Christian scholars. So Christians are called to return to the faithful following of the practice and teaching of Jesus. They are to have hearts full of tenderness and mercy, just as Jesus had a tender and merciful heart, and they are to convert to Islam. A double reward is offered when they should convert. And the Quran comes to correct the errors that have come into their practice and belief. Let's turn then to look at what the Quran has to say about Jesus, because there are many verses in the Quran that speak about Jesus, the son of Mary. This is the most common term which is used for him in the Quran, and it is a reminder that Jesus had no father. And so the normal practice would be to name somebody after their father. And by naming Jesus after his mother instead, it's a reminder to us constantly that Jesus has no father. It is also a correction against the Christian use of the term Son of God, for example. So Jesus, the son of Mary. Also the term Al-Masih, or the Messiah, is used often in the Quran of Jesus, meaning that he is the anointed or the chosen one of God. We're told that Jesus is born of the Virgin Mary, born without any sexual intercourse, born without any physical activity, rather born by the word of command of God. The angel Gabriel comes to Mary with greetings from God that she is to become pregnant, and by the word of command, be, she is pregnant. This is a parallel to the way in which God created the first human beings. So there is no suggestion here in Islamic understanding that this would make Jesus divine. Rather, Adam and Eve had no mother and no father. These are signs of God's miraculous power, God who can create life as God so wills, and therefore God creates life in the womb of the Virgin Mary. This is a particular characteristic of Jesus, but it does not in any way elevate him above that which is human. It is also said in the Quran that he is a word from God cast into the womb of the Virgin Mary, And a word from God is this divine command, the be. Be and you are pregnant. Be and you exist. In the same way, the Quran speaks of Jesus as being Spirit of God, cast into the womb of the Virgin Mary, and therefore the spirit of prophecy, the spirit which is given to all prophets, is given to Jesus at his very conception. And it is one of the characteristics of Jesus that as a small baby, he speaks words of prophecy from the cradle. This is a sign of God's blessing upon him. The Quran also tells us that he is a prophet of God, that he is a perfect exemplar to be followed. Now, he is an exemplar not only to his own followers, the Christians, but also to all godly people. So there are traditions that circulate in Arabic amongst Muslims, which are pieces of teaching of Jesus, which can be used for character building amongst young Muslims who are growing up. He is a prophet of God. That is the highest honor that can be given to any human being. One of those sinless ones chosen by God to bear the message into the world. At the same time, the Quran is also clear in saying that Jesus is a creature of God. God created him. God could at any stage have terminated his life. Jesus as a prophet is given a scripture. This scripture is called in the Quran the Injil. This prophet and scripture are sent to the children of Israel. So Jesus is a prophet to the Hebrew people, not a universal prophet. Muhammad is the universal prophet according to Islam. Jesus also works miracles. We normally divide miracles into nature miracles, and Jesus works those. He makes birds out of clay, claps his hands, and off they fly. Healing miracles, the Quran tells us that he heals the blind, he makes the lame to walk, and also raising from the dead miracles. Now again, every time that the Quran mentions these miracles, there's always the caveat, by the power of God, at the will of God. So this is not something that Jesus does by his own power, at his own will. Rather, he is the agent of God and shows forth the mighty works of God, not his own works. When the Quran mentions the miracles of Jesus, it goes on in the very same chapter, the next verses, to point out that Jesus is not divine. And therefore there is no sign that miracle working is a sign of the divinity of Jesus. The Quran also takes disagreement with traditional Christian teaching about the end of the earthly life of Jesus. The Quran tells us that the Jews did not crucify Jesus. They neither crucified him nor killed him, but it appeared to them as though they did, and that Jesus was taken up from them. Now, the Quran is clear in saying that God protects his faithful messengers, and so God is protecting Jesus at the end of his life in Palestine. Things have gone wrong, and he is about to be put to death in a most horrible and ignoble way. And in Islamic understanding, based on this verse of the Quran, Jesus is then taken up from them by God. He is not crucified, he is not killed. Somebody else is crucified in his place, and various candidates are put forward. Maybe Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus, maybe a volunteer, maybe somebody from the crowd or an onlooker. Somebody else is crucified instead. It appeared to them as though it were Jesus, but he was taken up from them, and is currently with God, awaiting the divine command to return to the earth. When Jesus returns, he will return to take up his one and only earthly life. He will resume the life that was left before the crucifixion of someone else took place. When he returns, he will return to bring about the great battle of good versus evil, in which good will reign, in which evil will be put to flight. He will correct the errors that have come into his Christian followers. He will rule the world for a period of time in uprightness and truth. And he will be doing this together with Al-Mahdi, variously understood by different schools of Islam. At the end of his earthly life, he will die, his one and only death. He will be buried in Medina. His grave space awaits him alongside the grave of Muhammad. Then there will be a sign that the end of the world should come, then a bleak period of waiting, and then the angel will sound the trumpet for the resurrection. And all will then rise from their graves, including Jesus, Muhammad, everyone else who has ever lived, and then there will be the day of judgment. And on the day of judgment, Jesus will be a witness to his community, to those who have followed or have failed to follow the true teaching that he was given by God. One of the excesses that has entered into Christian tradition, according to Islam, is the idea that somehow Jesus is the Son of God. This is quite unacceptable in Islam, because it breaches the principle of the transcendent nature of God. And it also means that either if Jesus is Son of God, then he is God, or there are two gods. Both of these will be quite unacceptable. Where does this come from? Well, it was part of the tradition of the ancient Arabs that gods had children, you had families of gods. And the Quran says again and again, don't go and make the same mistake that the ancients made in ascribing children to God. And here the term walud is used to talk of an offspring. God has no offspring, the Quran says again and again. There is, however, another term in Arabic which is used for son, ibn. And ibn can mean son as in procreation, but it can also mean son in an honorific way, one who is given great honor and love. And some Muslim scholars have said, based on a verse of the Quran, that what the Christians have done is to taken this metaphoric, honorific use of the word ibn. Jesus is given great honor by God, and they have interpreted it literally, and they have thus elevated Jesus to divine status. This is not something that can have been taught by Jesus himself, because Jesus in Islamic understanding taught pure monotheism, tawheed. This then must be something which has crept into the Christian tradition in later generations, and again the Quran points toward the Christian leaders and scholars and say, you have taken them as lords instead of God. You have listened to them instead of listening to the true message of God. In 3 places, the Quran corrects any idea that there could be any kind of threeness about God. The Quran says, say not of God that God is the third of 3. That's polytheism. That's tritheism. That is totally unacceptable in Islam. Do not imitate the errors of the polytheists by attributing any kind of multiplicity to God. Again, the Quran says, say not three. Stop, desist. Do not say this. Now, the Quran is correcting here any idea of a plurality in God, tritheism. However, the Quran knows that Christians are speaking of Trinity, and therefore there is a question as to whether Trinity is indeed tritheism, a belief in three gods. And Muslim scholars have investigated and have discussed this question over the centuries, and any idea of Trinity being tritheism, multiplicity, plurality in God is strictly forbidden by the Quran and by the Islamic tradition. Therefore, God is one, say not of God three. It's very important just to conclude by saying that these excesses that have entered into Christian tradition according to Islam and the Quran cannot be attributed to Jesus or to the scripture, the Injil that he was given, because Jesus is a true prophet who taught Tawheed, and the revelation from God is a pure, direct sending down to Jesus. Therefore, they must have come in through Christian excess down through the centuries. And a lot of discussion has gone on, a lot of writing has taken place, a lot of polemics have taken place about the way in which Christians have distorted the true meaning of Jesus' teaching. Of course, Christian scholars have denied that Trinity in any way means a plurality within God, and that therefore that is not what they are teaching. This discussion must carry on between the scholars. The Quran and Islam is clear that God is one and one only, and any talk of three is unacceptable, that God is far exalted above having a child, an offspring, and that Jesus is the human prophet, the creature of God, that God could have destroyed at any time if God had so chosen. Join me next week when we're going to be looking at the way in which some contemporary Muslim scholars, male and female, are talking about the position of women in Islam. I look forward to seeing you then.